All right, so this video is going to be all about sockets and socket drivers. So first things first, hopefully you watched the previous video on wrenches because sockets and wrenches have the same job. It is to either loosen or tighten a bolt or nut, generally with some sort of hex head or 12-point head. Wrenches are cool and all, but the problem is I have to, once I'm done turning the wrench, I have to take it off, move it, put it back on, and turn it. And this can be very time consuming. So rather, if I am trying to get a bolt off faster, I'm going to use instead some sort of socket driver like a ratchet. We'll talk about that in a moment. And I'm going to use some sort of socket. Now, the cool part about this is now what we're dealing with. I know I'm using an impact socket, but we'll talk about that in a minute. When I go to, say, turn my bolt or nut, I am going to pull or push. Generally, the goal is to pull so you don't bust your knuckles in the opposite direction. But I don't have to take it off to reposition it. I can simply, and I'll show you from this angle, move it, and I don't know if you guys can hear that, and continue in that motion. And I can do this fast enough to where I'm actually saving time rather than using a wrench. Now, let's sort of get into this because there's a lot that goes into sockets as well as ratchets. But first things first, you can see here we've got a hex head, and I'll talk about the difference between 6-point, 12-point. I kind of did in the wrench video. So this is meant to fit onto a bolt or nut, right? And like I said, it's to either tighten or loosen. So let's get into the different types. There's actually 5 categories when we're talking about a socket. If I have a socket in my hand, there's so much for this tiny little tool to say. So if I'm looking at this particular socket, I can tell you that it is a metric 22 millimeter socket that is deep, and it is a 6-point impact 1/2 inch. So if you are apprenticing at a shop and your technician that you're working under says, I need a 1/2 inch drive deep impact socket that is 6-point and is 22 millimeter. That's a whole life story to this socket, right? That's a lot going on. So let me sort of break down these categories for you. So first and foremost, you need to know, is it metric or standard? And very much just like wrenches, our fractional numbers are going to be standard in fractions of an inch, right? And this term is referring to, just as wrenches, it's actually referring to the size of the bolt head. Where'd my bolt go? It's referring to the size of the bolt head from one edge to another. That also goes for metric as well. So metric is generally going to be the whole number. In the slide here, it just shows 12 here. Another thing that you can sort of look at if maybe you're like me, you don't have real good eyes, an indicator that a socket might be metric is if it has a bunch of little tiny lines, and you can see it probably better in your presentation. It may be metric. But like I said, look for the number. If it's a fraction, it's standard. If it is a whole number, it's generally going to be metric. Here's something to note. Let's say you're just getting into this and you're not sure what tools you need right now. Do I need to buy standard wrenches as well as metric wrenches, standard sockets as well as metric sockets? Here's an easy answer for you. You need to ask yourself, what are you working on, or what do you plan on working on? So if you plan on working on mainly newer cars, and when I say mainly, I'm talking pretty much 90s, 80s, and 90s and up, remotely modern, you will really only need metric tools. If you plan on working on older vehicles, you will generally need standard tools, older American. If we're talking older Japanese or German, you may still need metric tools because the rest of the world uses metric. America is pretty much the only ones who use standard in fractions of an inch and all that stuff. So Do you need standard tools if you plan on working for a Honda dealer? You really don't. So there's no point in wasting the money. If you plan on working for a hot rod shop, do you really need metric tools? You may not. So that's where your starting point should be. If you plan on working on everything, well, eventually you may want both. The cool thing is since not as many things use standard tools may be cheaper than your metric tools because there's much higher demand for your metric tools. But that's generally the sizing of your sockets. So if I have a bolt that has a 10 millimeter head, then I'm going to need a 10 millimeter socket. Or if I have a bolt with a 1/2 inch head, I'm going to need a 1/2 inch socket. So to break the sockets down even further, we've got two sides to them. We've got the drive side, where if we're looking at our socket here, we've got one side that's 6 point, and the other side is 4 point. That 4 point side is going to be your drive side, meaning whatever you're putting in there, whether that be an impact ratchet, whether that be a torque wrench, whether that be a breaker bar, whether that be a speed wrench, whether that be a ratchet, those are your socket drivers, and that is what's going to go into the back end of the socket in the drive end of it. The drive end is going to come in 3 different sizes. There's more. I know for those of you who work on diesels, you're like, but wait, what about? We're not talking about working on diesels. We're talking about working on gasoline engines. And if you're working on gasoline engines, there are 3 sizes that you're going to need. There are 1/4 inch, which is the tiniest. The middle, your Goldilocks, is going to be 3/8. And then the largest that you're going to need is generally going to be 1/2 inch. So if we look at these side by side, you can actually see the progression, right? So our smallest 1/4 inch, our middle 3/8, and our largest 1/2 inch. So when are you going to use those? Well, if I'm working on very tiny pieces, or maybe I don't have a lot of space for a smaller fastener or a smaller bolt, the 1/4 inch will work just fine, especially interior pieces. It's very nice because the tools are much smaller. If we're looking at a 1/4 inch ratchet versus a 1/2 inch ratchet, this one's really nice to get into those tiny little spaces. If I need to loosen something that's going to be really, really tight, this is not going to do a very good job. And you're going to fight it so much harder because that's not what this is meant for. You don't have any leverage. If you're trying to loosen something that's super duper tight and you have the space for it, you want the largest drive size that you can sort of get. But that's really going to depend on you. Now, I will tell you the most common size for drive size used is going to be your Goldilocks. The 3/8 drive is going to be the most commonly used because it sort of fits both. It's small enough to get into places, but it's large enough to be able to apply some torque without breaking things. There is a larger 3/4 and even 1 inch, but again, unless you're working on big diesels or big trucks, you're not going to need that much torque applied. So I don't necessarily recommend that you get sockets that are that large in a drive size. 1/4 inch, 3/8, and 1/2 inch. If you can only get one set of sockets, I do recommend probably getting the 3/8. But having socket sets with all 3 drive sizes will eventually be your friend. On the other side that goes onto the actual fastener, bolt, or nut, they do come in different shapes. So we've got 4 point, which you're like, wait, but isn't the drive size 4 point? Absolutely. So there is such a thing as a socket with a 4 point drive and a 4 point socket end there. So we've got socket point. Very rare, and you don't generally come across those. There is an 8 point that is also quite rare. You won't come across those near as often. 6 point is very common. So if we're looking at a 6 point socket, it looks just like that. And it's to match the 6 point head of your bolt or nut. And then at the end here, we've got 12 point. So if you want to see the difference between them, we've got a 6 point socket right here and a 12 point. Let's see, get a little closer. There. The 12 point is for 2 reasons. One, you have more access as far as angle goes. It will fit on the bolt head more different angles than the 6 point. But you're also going to lose contact area. And so you're a lot more apt to round out a bolt or a nut head with a 12-point socket if you're loosening something that's super tight. So if you're loosening something that's super tight, make sure you're using a 6-point socket. If you're using a socket, that will be your best bet. On a test, the best tool for loosening a really tight bolt or nut or stubborn bolt or nut is either going to be a box end wrench or a 6-point socket. If you can get a 6-point box end wrench, then you know that as well. But just know that those options are going to be your best bet. For 12-point bolts, the 12-point socket, like flywheel bolts are very commonly 12-point for certain manufacturers. 12-point is going to be your route. If it's a 12-point bolt, use a 12-point socket. If it is a 6-point bolt, then use a 6-point socket, and you will round things out a lot less. So that's just sort of the anatomy of the front and the back. If we look at the whole anatomy, here it's showing our drive size, number of points. It's showing the depth of our socket, which I'll talk about in the next slide here, standard or metric sizing, stuff like that. So if we look at deep versus shallow sockets, that would be the difference between these two right here. Each one has its advantage and disadvantage. The closer I am to the fastener, the less likely I'm going to have flex or movement of the head of my ratchet. Regardless, if you're loosening or tightening something, you should always have one hand on the ratchet head and the other hand loosening or tightening. If I use just one hand, the socket is going to possibly move around and round off, again, your bolt or nut. So 2 hands if you can. Sometimes you don't have space for it. The downfall of a shallow socket is, what if I have a bolt way down here and I can't reach it? Or let's say I can, but now my hand's up against the block or something like that. So that's where our deep sockets come into play. So that's the wrong drive size. Let's see if I can find. Our deep sockets are going to have a whole lot more space here. So now it moves my hand further away from whatever it is that I'm loosening or tightening, and it makes things a whole lot easier. The downfall is, because my fastener is down here, my ratchet's up here, I've got a lot of space for this to move around, and eventually if I'm applying a lot of turning or twisting force torque, then I could potentially round out my bolt or nut. So again, always place the hand on top of the ratchet head when you are loosening or tightening, and you can prevent a lot of those problems. They do make mid-range sockets as well if you really just like making it rain on the tool truck. But eventually you'll want to get a set of shallows and a set of deeps for both your standard and metric tools. The next category is going to be impact versus non-impact. So many of you guys have seen this. I've got a slide for our pneumatic tools here, but they make electric ones as well. Impact tools are going to provide a whole lot of torque, right, that we can't physically provide without using a breaker bar this long, right? So if I'm applying a lot of torque to a socket in a fastener, I need that socket to be stronger. So you will notice that certain sockets, impact sockets, are going to be dark gray in color, while our chrome sockets are much lighter. Our chrome sockets are made for hand tools. Our impact sockets are made for impact tools or power tools. And you will notice, if we put them side by side, that the side walls are actually thicker on your impact than your chrome sockets. Here's the deal. You can use impact sockets on a power tool or a hand tool. Downfall of an impact socket is that the sidewall is super thick, and so sometimes it doesn't always fit in places that you need it to, and they're also quite heavy. Now, our chrome sockets are much lighter, but their downfall is that they are weak in comparison. So you should never be using chrome sockets on a power tool. If you do, what will happen eventually is you'll crack the sidewall. And then let's say you got Craftsman, or let's say you got Husky, and you got a nice warranty on your tools. Well, when you go to warranty those tools, they're going to be like, I wonder how you cracked the sidewall. What they'll do is they'll look at the back side of the drive, and they'll notice, this one's actually a great example because it's been beat up and chewed up. The corners have actually been rounded out on the drive from a pneumatic tool or an impact tool sort of hammering on it, because that's what an impact tool will do. It actually sort of hammers to apply that torque. By the way, while we're there, when you're trying to loosen something, when you go to apply pressure, don't apply slow pressure, jolt. When you jolt, that pressure is fast, and that's why impacts work very well. When you apply slow pressure, it's going to be a lot harder for you to break something loose. So just sort of a little tech tip there. But that's the main difference. Chrome sockets are not as strong. They are chrome in color, and you should never use them on power tools if you want to ever warranty them, because they will eventually break. Impact sockets are black or dark gray in color, thicker and stronger, and use on power tools. You can use them on hand tools, but they're not always easy to, because again, they're larger and heavier. Here's a closer picture of your sidewall in your presentation. Now let's talk a little bit more about socket drivers themselves. So the socket drivers are the piece that you're using to drive that socket. So the socket's meant to fit on your bolt or nut. So here are a few of the socket drivers that we're going to be using. The first one that I've already sort of mentioned, and many of you guys are already familiar with, is your handy dandy ratchet. I know that term can be used for other things these days. Ratchet is used, that term is used because of, you guys can hear that ratcheting mechanism. So what we have inside is a toothed wheel, like a gear, right? And then we've got, on the outside it has teeth, and then we've got a sort of another gear that has teeth on the inside, but these teeth are directional, so as you turn it, they sort of lock in place. It'll allow it to turn in one direction, but when you try to go back in the other direction, it will actually engage. And depending on which direction it's going to engage in is going to depend on the switch on the back of your ratchet here. So sometimes it'll say on, sometimes it'll say off. Sometimes they won't give you any labeling at all. Here's what you need to know. Anytime you are trying to tighten something, make something go clockwise, we use the phrase righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. So righty-tighty, clockwise, would be making something tighten, more tight. If I'm trying to loosen something, I would click this in the off position, and it would go counterclockwise, or the teeth would catch counterclockwise to loosen, so lefty-loosey. That's why they call this a ratchet. It's because of those teeth inside. They call that a ratchet mechanism. Now, these ratchets can come in all different sizes and lengths. They make stubby ratchets where it has pretty much no handle, and you got a tiny little handle at the end so they can fit in tiny little places. You've got that. This is sort of the size of an average 3/8 ratchet. This drive, so your ratchet has a drive that goes into the backside of your socket, right? It'll generally have some sort of ball too that locks it in place. Craftsman likes to use a lock button on the back that'll make that ball go in, and it's really hard to get the socket off without pressing your button. Snap-on is just a ball that sort of presses in so you can pull the socket or push it on. But our drive can come in the same size as we talked about. We can have a 1/4 inch drive. You can see it's much smaller than our 3/8 drive. Or we can have a 1/2 inch drive that is much larger than the other ones, right? So we've got a large 1/2 inch ratchet, a smaller 3/8 ratchet, and an even smaller 1/4 inch ratchet. Your 1/4 inch ratchets can come in longer handles or shorter handles, just like all your other ratchets. But they all do the same thing. They all have some sort of switch on the back. They are all going to have the ratcheting mechanism. That's why they're called a ratchet. Now the next one down is meant to do the same thing as far as moving a socket, so it has a drive, but this is called what we call a breaker bar. And its name is part of its purpose. So you'll notice the top has a drive, right? This one happens to be 3/8, but they come in 1/2 inch, 3/8, 1/4 inch. The difference between this and a ratchet is it has no ratchet mechanism inside. Instead, we've got a joint, right? It's actually a universal joint here. So this is sort of able to swivel back and forth. This is actually a much stronger design than the ratchet. If you're breaking something loose, you don't really want to do it with the ratchet. And the reason for this is because the ratcheting mechanism with the teeth can eventually break the teeth if you apply way too much pressure to them. So if you want to make your tools last, you're going to want to break stuff loose with a breaker bar and then take it all the way off using the ratchet, and your ratchet will last a whole lot longer. Now, if you've got a lifetime warranty, by all means, manhandle that ratchet. But the breaker bars can come in really long sizes, so you can apply extra torque. Remember, the longer the handle, the more leverage you are given. I am not a very large person, and so I have a set of very large breaker bars in my toolbox, so I can have enough leverage to apply the pressure of somebody much larger than me. They do make small breaker bars to get in smaller places, but again, you are limited on the amount of torque you can apply because of how small they are. But really, breaker bars are meant to break stuff loose first. And once you've broken that bolt loose, then you can go ahead and put the socket back on the ratchet and sort of ratchet away until you get it out. The next one down is what we call a speed wrench. And with electric power tools, this sort of phased away. But this is what we call a speed wrench. Some people call it speeder handles. The anatomy of this drive is, of this driver is that we have a drive. All socket drivers have some sort of drive. Again, can be 1/4 inch, 3/8, or 1/2 inch. Then on the other end, we have a handle that spins. So it spins freely. I don't know if you guys can see that. That's meant to do that so I can hold on to this. I'm going to put my, let's say my socket onto the back of this, put this on the bolt or nut, and I'm going to hold the top with one hand and the handle with another, and I can just sort of speed away at loosening something. Now, you don't have very much leverage here, so these aren't great for tightening. It's meant to save you some time rather than ratcheting away. But with electric power tools, we don't see a lot of this anymore. I do have a couple of these in my toolbox because I find them quite handy. Sometimes you don't necessarily want to strip stuff out on accident, and sometimes electric tools can do that. So these are actually a lot cheaper than your power tools. So let's say you can't afford a battery-powered impact and you want to be able to do stuff fast. Speed wrench is very nice to have, especially when you're talking about a lot of little fasteners, stuff like transmission pan bolts or oil pan bolts, stuff like that. This is a great tool to have that is affordable. The next set of socket drivers would be torque wrenches. So I've been using this term torque quite a bit. Torque is referring to the actual type of wrench that it is. It's actually not a wrench. It should be called a torque ratchet, but we call them torque wrenches. So this looks very much like a ratchet, except it's got this extra stuff down here. So just like a ratchet, it has a drive size. And again, they come in all the different sizes. On the back side, we've got an on and off. And down here, we have an adjustment. So certain torque wrenches will have an adjustability where we've got a sleeve that locks my handle in place. But if we look closer, we have numbers on there. And as I unlock and turn my handle here, I can adjust the setting at which this torque wrench is at. And let me go back and explain what this even is. A torque wrench is used when you want to closely monitor how tight you're tightening a bolt or nut. Because do you just tighten every bolt or nut as tight as you can? Well, if you're one of those people, you're going to spend a lot of time using easy outs or extractors because you stripped out the threads of a lot of bolts or nuts or anything that's threaded. Sometimes you're working with things that it's very important that you tighten them to the exact specification that they're meant. Bolts and nuts are made, and screws, everything, they're made of different types of metal depending on the need of the strength. Certain bolts are much stronger than others or tougher than others, while others we may call butter bolts because the metal is so soft because of the application. Torque wrenches are going to let you know exactly how tight you are tightening a bolt or nut to. So let's say I go on my service information and it says I'm supposed to tighten a brake caliper bracket bolt to 50 foot-pounds. I can set my torque wrench to 50 foot-pounds or Newton meters, whatever range you're using. If I had this set at 50 foot-pounds, once I tighten my bolt to 50 foot-pounds, this is actually going to make a click. And there are different types of torque wrenches I'll get here in the next couple of slides. But the torque wrench in general, no matter what kind it is meant to let you know how tight you are tightening a bolt or nut or some sort of fastener. These are considered precision measuring tools. So if you drop them, they fall out of calibration and are no longer accurate. And so I might set it to 50, but it won't click until 70. Well, that's a problem, and I might start breaking fasteners because my torque wrench is out of adjustment. So it's important to keep very good care of these. Make sure they stay clean. Make sure they are, you're always checking their calibration. Don't drop them. They fall out of calibration. And always, lastly, always make sure that you loosen them out to around, let's say 0 or a very low tension. Because if I set this at 50 foot-pounds and then I'm done with it and I put it away, eventually the spring tension inside will fall out of calibration. So zero them out when you're done, keep them clean, and don't drop them so they stay in calibration. You can buy a Craftsman torque wrench, and as long as you take care of it, that sucker will stay in calibration for a long time. I have a set of smaller torque wrenches, larger torque wrenches, depending on the application. When you're building engines and things like that, you may need ones that go down to a very small size, so 7 foot-pounds or 5 foot-pounds. They even make inch-pound ones for torque settings that are very, very light. So that's your torque wrench. The next one down is not necessarily the driver itself that you are applying torque to, but it's an in-between. So let's say I have a bolt, but it's way down here in the engine bay, and I can only get access from up here. Well, what I can do with my socket is, before I go ahead and put it on my ratchet here, so I can have an extension. We add an extension. So they make extensions. They have a female drive in the back to go onto your driver, whether that be a ratchet, whether that be a torque wrench, whether that be a breaker bar. And then at the end, the male drive is going to go into the socket itself. So now I can reach down to my fastener that's way deep down in there. Just know I am going to get some flex here. So if I'm trying to loosen something that's super duper tight, you may have to put forth more effort because of the flex that happens down here. So if you don't have to use an extension, you may not want to for something that's super duper tight. And again, it's very important you sort of two-hand that, so one on the head while the other is loosening or tightening, so this doesn't flex around and strip a bolt or nut out. The last one here on this page are universals. Many of you guys might know them as wobblies. So this is a type of extension. I've got a female drive in the back, and that's going to go onto my ratchet, and a male end that's going to go onto my socket. Now, the whole purpose of this universal joint here is because maybe I can't get around something, or maybe this bolt is at a particular angle. Let's say I'm not going straight on, I need to sort of angle this here. That's where this universal will come into play. So now my socket can sort of wobble around, and maybe I can loosen or tighten something that's sort of at a funky angle. Now they are limited, because if I start to do angles like this, they bind up. And they won't work, so they are limited with their working angles. They also make socket sets that are universals as well. So the sockets themselves are wobbly, so you can see all of these have a sort of joint in them that allow for movement like that. So universals can be quite handy. If you don't want to buy multiple socket sets because it gets expensive, you can just buy a set of 3 sort of universal extensions. I put in a couple of funny memes here. If you get them, you get them. If you don't, wait till your next class. You might get these a little bit more. When you start coming across bolts that really don't want to come loose, we've got our tiny ratchets that says, please come loose. The middle ratchets, I hope it comes loose. The larger ratchet, and if you're using this, you may want to use a breaker bar here. I wasn't asking. Then we get out the cutter wheel. You should have listened. And then we've got the torch. It can't be tight if it's liquid. We've got converters. So let's say you can only afford a 3/8 drive set of sockets, right? But you only have a 1/2-inch ratchet. Or vice versa. So they make converters that will take something, let's say, from a 3/8 to a 1/4, or something from a 3/8 to a 1/2-inch drive. So I can use a 1/2-inch socket on a 3/8 ratchet if I use a converter. So converters allow you to sort of use and mismatch your tools with your socket drivers. Let's say I can only afford a set, like I said, of 3/8 sockets, but I only have an impact that is a 1/2-inch drive, so I can convert one to the other. But you want to be careful when you're starting to apply lots of torque. I'll let you guys read this meme, but this is sort of an example. We've got a 1/4-inch ratchet using a couple different converters. So from a 1/4 to 3/8, and then another converter from 3/8 to 1/2-inch, and it actually almost looks like there's 3 converters to even bigger size, so we can use this gigantic socket. It's not a good idea to do that, but sometimes you do things out of necessity when you have to. Types of torque wrenches you'll come across, the oldest and cheapest design is going to be your beam type. The only reason I don't like beam type is because you actually adjust them by bending the metal beam, and anything you have to adjust like that is not going to be very precise. So beam type torque wrenches, pro, they're cheap. Con, they're not very accurate. Your click type is going to be your best bang for your buck. It's going to be very accurate and easy to read. So your beam type torque wrench and actually your dial type torque wrench, the problems with those is if I'm looking at them from an angle, I might read a different number. Very much like when you're looking at your speedometer when you're driving versus your passenger looking at your speedometer, it might look like a different speed. And so those are the downfalls of your dial type torque wrench versus your and your beam type. Your click type, it clicks right when you're on that foot-pound setting. And so no matter what angle you're at, you can feel that click. And then the electronic is going to be your most expensive design. However, so it's just like a click type, except for instead of clicking mechanically, it actually will have an audible beep. The cool part about the electronic is a lot of times they'll have an angle setting in them. We'll talk more about that when we get into fasteners next week. But your angle is you may need an angle setting when you are dealing with torque to yield bolts. So if you're not familiar with those, I may have a bolt that, say, its spec is 50 foot-pounds plus 45 degrees. That means that I need to take my torque wrench and I set it to, let's say, 50 foot-pounds, right? Sorry, this is my torque wrench. And it'll click at 50 foot-pounds, but the torque to yield says plus 45 degrees. That means I need to move my ratchet or my torque wrench an additional 45 degrees, right? So 90 degrees would be a right angle, so about 45 would be about halfway. Well, I can get a roundabout with a click type, right? Like that looks about 45 degrees, but with an electronic, sometimes, not all electronic, but some electronics will actually allow you to set the 45-degree angle, and it will actually beep at you once you hit that 45-degree angle. So the electronic is the nicest, and I would argue sometimes the most precise. Again, they can fall out of calibration, but I say more precise simply because of that angle gauge that they may have. The last drivers I want to talk about are going to be your impact wrenches and ratchets. So we have impact guns, right, that may or may not be pneumatic. This one happens to be pneumatic. So it's got an air fitting at the bottom, and they will generally have some sort of means. This one, to switch direction, you can push or pull this button back here, and you can actually turn this dial here on the back. You pull this cover up so you guys can see. What if I don't want a whole lot of torque? You've got a little gauge there, so we can set this to where I can apply a lot of torque or a little torque. What if I'm loosening something that is just being stubborn? I can turn that sucker all the way up, make sure this is on lefty-loosey, and then go to town. You don't want to do that when you're tightening things. just FYI. That's how bad things happen and damage happens. Now they do make your impact wrenches in different sizes. So this is a 1/2 inch drive. This one we've got a 3/8 drive, and they do make 1/4 inch drive ones. Again, the larger is going to be able to apply more torque. The smaller ones are just simply for speed. They also make electric battery powered ones. So if you don't want to, if let's say you don't have an air compressor at home, you can buy a battery powered impact, and it does the same thing. It applies a whole lot more torque than you can. And it's also faster. So when we're thinking about speed, I highly recommend that if you're new to this, you do not use these to tighten. You only use these to loosen. It'll save you a whole lot of hassle from having to fix stripped components. So I highly recommend you follow that advice. The last one is impact ratchets. So very similar to our impact gun here. We've got a piece that looks very much like a ratchet. We've got a drive. This one happens to be a 1/4 inch drive. It's very tiny, and just like any other ratchet, it has a loosen or tighten switch on the back here. And we've got a trigger, just like this one here. We've got an air fitting on the back because this one is pneumatic, meaning it's air powered. And again, this one's going to be mainly for speed. They do have a lot of torque. Be very careful with these because especially, let's say you are trying to tighten or loosen something. If anything is in front of your knuckles, it'll turn the bolt, turn and turn and turn and turn and turn. Let's see, it fits on, sorry, a socket, kind of like this. And I'm using the wrong socket. This is chrome, right? It should be impact. But it'll turn and turn and turn and turn and turn until the bolt stops, and then it will try to turn your hand. I've cut myself and hurt myself plenty of times with these, so be very careful with these. They also make these battery powered as well. It's very nice because you can sort of fit them sometimes in areas where you can't get air lines. I will see you guys in the next video to get into hammers.